Welcome to the Sunday discussion, Mike and Jammer. uh, Thank you, God, for being here. So we're going to talk about the PreSocratics today, and as I've already kind of told Jammer, the PreSocratics were the philosophers that came before Socrates, and they're called that because Socrates was just like so game-changing that there's before Socrates and after Socrates. And so these are the guys that came before. They were 5th and 6th century BC. So, pretty long time, hundreds and hundreds of years before Jesus. Um, they are considered the first philosophers. We're going to go over the very first philosopher in Western society. Even maybe in Eastern society too, because Buddha wasn't around for another couple hundred years at this point. But there were older possible Eastern religions. And we are making a split here between philosophy and theology. What they were talking about wasn't a religion. They were basically saying we can figure out the answers. And whether they thought that was through the study of the natural world or the mind or something else, they thought an answer was possible instead of just saying God's did it or God created everything. Gods are responsible for lightning. So it was this radical new shift in thinking that transformed all of Western society into what we have now, which is very focused on science and observable facts and truth and what can we prove and disprove. The basis of science came out of all of this. So, mostly the pre-Socratics were focused on metaphysics. What is the universe made of? How did it get here? Is everything changing or is everything permanent? They also sort of looked into how do you live the good life, but mostly they studied the metaphysics of it. And then Socrates kind of came along and basically said, who cares what the universe is made of? It doesn't affect the quality of my life, and it doesn't matter, therefore, and what we really need to focus on is how do we live the best, most virtuous life. And that completely changed philosophy, and that's what everybody was talking about afterwards. They kind of put the how did we get here sort of to rest. I mean, they still would talk about what is the universe made of, but that started to develop into sciences. But with philosophy, Socrates made it more about ethics. Cicero said that Socrates, and this is a great quote, called philosophy down from the skies and implanted it in the cities and homes of men, compelling it to attend to questions of virtue and vice, good and evil. So, instead of talking about what is the universe made of, where did it come from, the average person doesn't care about that. And the question of what is virtuous, how do you live a good life, that was much more interesting. That was something that the average person could think about, read about, understand, apply to their lives. And this is part of why Socrates was so game-changing, even though they do still sort of address those other things. So, to understand this big shift in Western civilization, it is important to understand the pre-Socratics and kind of how did Socrates get to where he got? What was he responding to? What was he studying when he came up with a lot of his things? We're going to start with Thales, who is considered the first philosopher. Let's see here. The first three philosophers are called the Milesians: Thales, Anaximander, and Anaximenes. They all three lived in the city of Miletus, which was in western Turkey. So they all probably, influenced each other and were influenced by the city they were living in. And, something about this place really sprang up the first philosophical discussions in western Turkey. Let's see. They thought that reality consisted of two fundamental characteristics. that everything is constantly changing and that there is an infinite plurality of things, that everything that exists is different from everything else that has ever existed or will exist, and that there is an infinite variation on these things. Um, and so, underlying this plurality and all of the change and all of the differences that they saw in the world, they looked out and they saw different animals, different plants, the sun and the moon, and night and day, and they saw all these differences, and they said, underlying all of this, there exists a permanent substance that everything is made of, and they called it the arche, Arche. It's translated to, that word means origin, source, beginning. It's also sometimes translated as ruler or authority. And it was thought to be this material substance that was endowed with a kind of spirit or intelligence or divinity, and it was self-caused. It wasn't caused by anything else, and therefore it was the ruler of all things, because everything that existed came from it or was created by it. So Thales, the very first guy to the stage who started wondering about this, said that the arche was, or arche, I'm not sure which, arche maybe, that the arche was made of water. And so we don't really have any writings of Thales. He, I think, did write stuff, but it was never saved. It's lost to history. So all we really have is references to him. So I think it was Plato that surmised that Thales thought everything was made of water because water was so essential to life. Everything needed water to live, all life and plant life, and that it was kind of more like a divine, intelligent water that everything else made of. We don't really know much beyond that position. There's a couple other things about Thales, but that's pretty much it. Is they were trying to figure out, the Greeks kind of thought there are 4 basic elements: water, fire, earth, and air. And they were looking at the world through this lens. They saw things that were hot. They saw things that were cold. They saw things that were dead and still, like rocks and earth. And then they saw this life, of course. And then there's air, which seems to be this, thing that we all live in. And so they were trying to say, of these 4 primary elements, how do we describe the world around us? So Thales went with water. Anaximander, who was the next guy to the stage, said that each of these 4 elements, earth, water, fire, and air, is finite, and they're limited. Air has a certain place where it stops, and water begins. Fire isn't everywhere, it's only here, and it's not the same as earth. So if these things are limited, they can't be the arche, because the arche has to be unlimited, or the arche. The arche, according to Anaximander, was a non-perceptible substance that he called the apeiron. The apeiron is a Greek word which means not limited. The A is negative, and paras is like a limit. So it was the literally not limited, also translated as boundless or indefinite. He said that all of these opposites that we experience, like hot and cold, wet and dry, the 4 elements themselves, were originally mixed together in the apeiron as this undifferentiated mass, and everything was the same, and that they were separated out from the apeiron to form the world from the 4 elements that we know of it now. And from the boundless, the apeiron, all these things come into being that we see, and when they perish, they go back into the apeiron, the boundless. I think I have a quote here. Yeah. Anaximander of Miletus says that the first principle of existing things is the boundless. For from this all come into being, and into it all perish. Wherefore innumerable worlds are both brought to birth and again dissolved into that out of which they came. and that quote is by Aetius. Welcome, Anemoyan Arts, to the Sunday discussion. We're talking about the PreSocratics, and Mike, I don't know if you're there, but you're probably already noticing some similarities between this and early Buddhism. The idea of arising and passing away, the idea of this unified substance, this apeiron that has no limit, no bounds, and out of which everything that is in reality came to be. Now, Buddhism doesn't have the four elements, of course, and they really
Actually, it does.
Oh, does it really?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
I didn't know that. I've never seen that before.
Yeah, the Buddha talks about the four elements, and they're exactly the same.
Earth, air, fire, and water.
Yep.
Yeah, it's these are the earliest minds that are trying to understand the world around us. And so they're trying to explain the things they see. And they see, oh, this is cold and this is hot. And these two things are related somehow. And they're trying to kind of figure out how.
Yeah, I believe he would say something like, all form is made of these four elements, or one of the four elements.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the four elements were pretty big until we get a little further down. But for the first three, that's pretty much what they were talking about. So Thales was water, Anaximander was this apeiron, which is, kind of a combination of all of them, but with no differences between them. Very non-dual. And Anaximenes, the third guy, he said that the arche was air. So he said everything comes from air, and he was kind of the first guy to try to give a scientific theory or a scientific hypothesis for this. So he kind of was trying to say, well, look, air can vaporize. Like, water droplets vaporize and turn into air, and air can condense and turn into water, and we can observe that. And if air can condense into water, then it can probably also condense further into rock. And if it can vaporize back into air, it can probably also vaporize further into fire. So he said, based on what we observe, air is the arche. And kind of a modern version of what they're all trying to do is like the theory of everything, where we're trying to explain the world with the theory of everything. But so those were the first three. And then we move on to probably my favorite of the bunch, who is Heraclitus. Heraclitus is often quoted in our server. He is the guy that said, you can't step in the same river twice. Another favorite quote of mine from him is, the way upward and the way downward are the same, meaning that it's the same road, and it just depends on which way you're walking. Heraclitus was born in a Greek city named Ephesus. He was nicknamed the weeping philosopher or the crying philosopher, and that's because a lot of what he came to conclude is sort of nihilistic, and he would often cry that the masses weren't able to understand this, that the average person didn't get this, and that most people live these kind of sad, pointless lives. So he was also nicknamed the Riddler and the Dark because he was very difficult to understand, and he almost did it on purpose. He was kind of intentionally enigmatic because he thought that the truth should be difficult to understand. This quote from Socrates is really great. It says, Socrates was reading Heraclitus, and he read his book, and he said, what I understood was fine, and no doubt also what I didn't understand, but it needs a diver to get to the bottom of it. So, pretty deep stuff. So, Heraclitus was of royal descent. He was apparently going to become the king of Ephesus, the king of this Greek city, and, like, threw all of that away and left it to go become a philosopher and spend his life dedicated to searching for truth and wisdom. Um, there's a story that one day he was playing dice with children in the street, and these passing politicians who knew of him were bewildered that he was spending his time like this. And they said, "What are you doing?" And he said, "Why are you surprised, you good for nothings? Isn't it better than playing politics with you?" um, yeah, so he's kind of anti people. He didn't really like people. He didn't really like politicians, especially. He thought most people were ignorant conformists, like, oh my god, such conformists. Um, he thought that logos, which is kind of the process of reason, was something that permeated all of reality, and that the truth of reality was common. So Heraclitus thought that anybody could attain this truth, that it was pretty much everywhere you looked. It was the most common thing, and that it was an objective truth, but that most people didn't get it. And they lived in their own little reality tunnels, perceiving the world through their own opinions, beliefs, insecurities. They were these kind of sleepwalking masses. A quote from Heraclitus is, "Other men are unaware of what they do while awake, just as they forget what they do when asleep." So he thought people just walked around in these little reality tunnels, asleep to the world, which, of course, I think relates to the Buddhist concept of awakening. I think the sleep awake analogy is like kind of perfect for this stuff.
Yeah, I agree. Whenever you hear things like, um, the world is an illusion, what that really is saying is your world in your head with your opinions and your ideas, that is an illusion.
Yeah, I think Heraclitus is probably one of the few that comes the closest to Buddhist concepts with this. Um, and you're going to love this next part, Mike. He said, "Well, how do you wake up? How do you listen to the logos? How do you see this objective truth that's everywhere?" And he said, "You have to find it for yourself. You can't understand it through an academic study of books. You can't understand it by listening to another philosopher. The best that any philosopher can do is point to it, but that you have to see it for yourself." And he always said, "I searched myself and then learned everything I know from that search."
I like it.
Yeah, I mean, it's almost verbatim, I think, what the Buddha said. Unfortunately, Heraclitus does have a lot of differences, and his inevitable take on it was a kind of tragedy. That's why he's called the crying philosopher. He really saw all of this as sad. Um, and he's contrasted with Democritus, who is called the laughing philosopher, who we're going to talk about last. But people often bring up the two of them because they almost have a similar perspective, but then a very, very different contrasted perspective. And their takeaways, their reactions to what they felt they understood were so different. Um, so Heraclitus believed three essential things. He believed everything is in flux, everything is flowing, everything is changing all of the time, and that's why he said you can't step into the same river twice because it's not the same river and you're not the same person. And because nothing is permanent, even if it seems like it's permanent, even if the desk in front of you seems like it's not changing or moving at all, it is constantly morphing into a new thing in each instant. And this is an endless thing. And that part of the reason he was so sad about all of this was that he thought that knowledge of the world through the senses was impossible. Because as soon as you could attain knowledge of something, a moment later, that knowledge becomes completely obsolete because everything has changed again, and your knowledge is old. And therefore, an absolute truth doesn't really exist that you could ever understand. And so he kind of fell into a bit of a nihilism with this, because it didn't matter to search for the truth, because everything that we value and achieve will just ultimately decay and die, and nothing will last. Um, and in the so in the Academy of Ideas videos, which I linked, which I hope people watch because they're really good, there's a quote from the Epic of Gilgamesh, which says, "Mere man, his days are numbered. Whatever he may do, he is but wind." So it's interesting that he looked at this impermanence of reality, and it really made him sad for it, that there was nothing to hold on to because everything was changing. It's a different reaction to the Buddha, who attained a kind of peace about that. And perhaps we might say Heraclitus was still clinging to the concept of permanence and wanting things to not change. So that's his first truth. The second one, all three of these are kind of the same. The second thing that he talks a lot about is that everything is a kind of ever-living fire. So of the four elements, I think it was Anaximander and Thales, they thought air and water, and Heraclitus is saying no, everything's fire. But it's kind of more of a symbolic fire, and he kind of used it as a symbol for the changing of everything. So, fire is constantly consuming and growing or dying, and it's never stationary, it's always moving. And so he used that as a symbol for all of reality, is constantly kind of consuming and changing and moving constantly in that way. And this was part of what really inspired the Stoics. The Stoics loved this idea that everything was fire, and that this fire is logos, and that the logos is kind of rationality, or intelligence. It's the concept of reason, I want to say. I don't know if concept is the right word, but Heraclitus believed that your soul was a kind of fire, and that when you die, your soul becomes wet, or that when you don't live a good life that uses reason, when you're not using reason or logos, you have more of a wet soul. There's this great quote: "A man when he is drunk stumbles and is led by a beardless boy, not knowing where he goes, for his soul is wet." So they do still believe in souls, and he did still have this contrast of elements in mind too. Any comments so far?
How do they define the soul?
I think that the ancient Greeks defined it as a kind of animation. Most of these philosophers believed that matter itself had a kind of spirit to it, so that matter was a spirit or a soul, and that your body kind of contained this soul that when you died would go into the ether, or would go into the air, or the Pyrrhon. It's not really until, I think, Parmenides that they make a separation between mind and matter. So they believed it was sort of the same as matter.
I love Parmenides.
Yeah, we're going to go over him. And actually, the word animate, or animation, or animal comes from anima, from the Greek word which means spirit. And so they thought that kind of movement and life, that there was this energy there that caused things to be animated. And that was the soul. So the third thing that Heraclitus talks about is that everything is war. everything is constantly at war with everything else. The only way that something comes into existence is from the destruction of something else. If heat comes into existence, it destroys cold in a way. Animals have to destroy other animals in order to eat, things like that. Most of the other Greeks thought that war was bad, that strife and war were kind of these evil forces, but Heraclitus thought that it was good. He thought that it was a kind of justice, or virtue even. He said everything is constituted by opposing forces and a combination of these opposing forces. One of the best analogies that I found for this is that it's like a bow that is strung, and a bow can be sitting there resting, but the bow, like a bow and arrow, only exists because of this tension between the wood and the string. And without that tension between the two holding it together, the bow itself wouldn't exist. And he thought all of reality had that kind of tension holding it together, and that kind of conflict and war was the spark of life, this fire, this spark that allowed for everything to move and exist in the first place. And many, many years later, Nietzsche, when reading Heraclitus, loved this idea because Nietzsche loved the concept that a great individual is not someone who has overcome their evil passions and they're free from internal strife. Nietzsche thought that the greatest individuals had a strong internal division and strife and passions engaged in battle with each other, and that this is where greatness came from, was that conflict. This was where wisdom came from. And I have a great quote from Nietzsche here. The essential point is, the greatest perhaps also possess great virtues, but in that case also their opposites. I believe that it is precisely through the presence of opposites and the feelings they occasion that the great man, the bow with a great tension, develops. And so he uses that same bow analogy that was referenced with Heraclitus. So Heraclitus is kind of an oddball here. He was very different from everybody else. He was famous for being so. He had this embracing of conflict and war and change and arising and passing away. This constant cycle of living and dying and fighting and strife and battle and war and chaos. He thought all of it was great. And that's why all of existence is here, is because of that conflict of opposites. I think in the later Gnostics, I believe, they called it the coincidentia oppositorum, the coincidence of opposites, that up cannot exist without down, and that the only reason the two exist is because they are opposites of each other and almost have that kind of war with each other, that tension.
I love this idea of the tension. That's amazing.
Mm-hmm.
Very provocative, because it makes sense to me intuitively that it would spur you on, right? In terms of creative kind of.
How popular was this idea of tension?
Internal competition, right?
I would say it wasn't too popular. The later philosophers from Parmenides and onwards really go into a different direction, and they start answering different questions. And Heraclitus, I mean, he his ideas didn't really stick. They didn't really hold. And once we get to Plato and Socrates, they have a whole different concept of reality with what is it made of and how do we find truth and all these things. They kind of put Heraclitus aside, so it's not super popular back then.
Ah, I see.
He did inspire the Stoics, though. They loved a lot of his ideas. I want to say that a lot of what the Stoic idea comes from is being at peace with that conflict, and not trying to resist it. But yeah, so Heraclitus he's probably my favorite pre-Socratic. I was really taken by Democritus this time when I was learning more about him, but Heraclitus is just so strange and different, and he is kind of what's the word? He's a misanthrope. He doesn't really like humanity, but I think that there's a way to look at what he was saying and still be cheerful about it and still, kind of appreciate that things are this way. You don't have to be the crying philosopher just because everything around you is constantly dying. Because without that tension, bows wouldn't exist. And I love that too. I think it also kind of explains the fundamental forces of existence, the strong and weak nuclear force, which is a kind of tension that keeps atoms together, gravity, the tension between revolving stars and planets, and the electromagnetic force. I mean, think about that tension between magnets being attracted to each other or repelled. And we're going to go into attraction and repelling as forces pretty soon here. I think maybe even next. Yeah, cool. I do have one more quote here from him. To fight with desire is hard. Whatever it wishes, it buys at the price of the soul. So he did think that you shouldn't try to extinguish your desires or your passions. You don't want to resist those things. Yeah, he was a good guy. So, next is Parmenides. Callie, do you know much about Parmenides? You said you really like him.
Really long time ago. I just remember that I met one of these translators in, I don't know, like almost 20 years ago now, maybe longer, who had translated Parmenides. And a lot of the new texts that came out that they had found, Parmenides indicated that he got a lot of inspiration from Taoism, and that they could track a lot of the etymology and philosophical history to Taoism. But I don't know how historians read it now, but that was kind of interesting to me.
Very interesting. So Parmenides really, there's almost a kind of before and after of Parmenides, just like Socrates. A lot of the philosophers that came before him were, addressing this change, this transformation of the things that we see and how and why things arise and pass away. And that was really a fundamental thing for them. And Parmenides came along, and he comes from southwest Italy area, and he said, nothing is changing. Nothing dies. Nothing is ever born. Nothing ever even moves. He said, all of reality is an illusion. And all of our sensory experiences that tell us that things move or change or die or are born is all an illusion as well. There are no separate things. Non-duality, hey, hey. This is a quote from Parmenides. It is unborn and imperishable. And he's talking about reality. Whole, unique, immovable, and without end. It was not in the past, nor yet shall it be, since it is now altogether one and continuous. So this is as close to the original Hindu concept of emptiness and nothingness that I think we get, and this really to a lot of philosophers that come after him, this becomes a real problem for them that he poses that they have to address and try to explain. So he basically said, we see reality and we think we see movement and we think we see change, but really nothing changes. And so it's a paradox. And actually, paradox is a Greek word which means contrary to appearances. And so the things and the way that reality appears to us is contrary to the truth. And a lot of his statements were very paradoxical for this reason. But he said, our senses are giving us this false information, and that only the mind and reason can understand this truth or any truth. And he was kind of an extreme rationalist in this way. All of the ancient Greeks loved the mind, all about that mind. And he said the mind's eye and reason alone can be used to attain the truth. And that with the mind, what we have is this argument that we can consider that says either something exists or it doesn't exist. Either it is or it is not. And the concept of nothingness can be utilized, but the concept of something that doesn't exist can't be utilized. So, I'll read a quote from him and then I'll kind of explain it because this is kind of difficult. He says, "Come now, I will tell thee the only two ways of search that can be thought of. The first, namely, that it is, and that it is impossible for anything not to be, is the way of conviction, for truth is its companion. The other, namely, that it is not, and that something needs to be, that, I tell thee, is a wholly untrustworthy path, for you cannot know what is not. That is impossible, nor can you utter it." So he's basically saying that the concept of not being or non-existence is an unintelligible concept. He's not saying that it's impossible for us to think of something that doesn't exist. Like I can think of unicorns, for instance, even though they don't exist. He's saying that it's impossible to form a concept of nothingness or non-being because all concepts contain content. And the concept of nothing would be a contentless concept. So it has no content in it because it's nothingness. And since it's impossible for us to have a concept of nothingness, we cannot use it to explain the world around us. So we cannot say that there was a time where this object didn't exist or was in a state of non-being, and that it came into being from a state of non-being. And therefore, the whole idea of coming into being, growing, dying out of existence is completely incoherent to him for this reason. And I would love people's thoughts on this.
Could you repeat the question or what you wanted thoughts on? I'm sorry.
It's fine. How about let me just do this quote from, I think it's Gorgias, who was trying to explain it. He said, "What is cannot have come into being. If it did, it came either from what is or what is not. But it did not come from what is, since if it is existent, it did not come to be but already is. Nor from what is not, for the non-existent cannot generate into anything." So they're basically saying you can't get something from nothing. And if you can't have existence from non-existence, then existence is eternal. It's always been around. And therefore nothing ever changes, because in order for it to change, something would have to go out of existence. And that's impossible. And Parmenides even goes far enough to say that movement itself is impossible because in reality, nothing really moves. For movement to even be possible, a thing must move from where it is now into a place where it is not. But that place where that thing doesn't exist can't be possible. And so movement itself is just an illusion. I know that's kind of a brain twister, and I think I've lost a couple people on that. uh, yeah. Philosophy. What are you gonna do?
I love it.
Sorry?
I mean, I love it. I love the idea that there is no movement. It's a great, very grand conception.
Yeah, and radically different from Heraclitus, who was right before him, who was basically saying that everything moves. Yeah, it's very different. And it was very contradictory to what they were trying to explain, which was the world around them, which they, you can see people dying, you can see babies being born, you can see things coming into and going out of existence. So for him to say all of this is an illusion and there's never a time where something didn't exist before, so it can't come into existence now and it can't go out of existence later, was just very strange for them. So there's this whole before Parmenides and after Parmenides idea. And so I'm really curious how that relates to Taoism from what you said, Callie, because it seems very non-dual.
Is Taoism dualistic?
Isn't it?
Or no?
I would have said so, because of the yin-yang.
I think the yin yang conception comes later. I mean,
Yeah.
Taoism, does Taoism say explicitly, or the Tao Te Ching, does it explicitly say yin yang?
No,
Or maybe it does.
I think you're right, it comes later, but the Tao Te Ching does talk about change a lot. And Parmenides is saying change is not possible.
All right. Well, it is interesting to me that what gets translated, so I do wonder if Parmenides was reading a Chinese translation or whatever, But
Yeah, I mean, I'm always really fascinated to think about how possible it might have been that Eastern thought got, sent or made its way somehow to, the Mesopotamia area, to, Europe or the Middle East, and what ideas from Western civilization might have made their way east, especially in those really early times. But it seems if we just look at the ancient Greeks, this was a very new concept because they were all trying to describe change, and he was basically saying change isn't even real. It doesn't exist. Movement is impossible. Nothing moves. So I have a quote here from a guy named James Warren who's describing Parmenides' idea, and he says, Parmenides left us with an odd and alienating picture of reality. Following consistently the ban on what is not, it has turned out that we are left with an unfamiliar reality which leaves no room for change, plurality, motion, difference, people, days, or nights. And so everybody after Parmenides had to kind of reconcile this. They had to basically say, well, yeah, what do we do about this problem of getting something from nothing? How can anything come into existence if it didn't exist before? And how can we use that to explain the way that we see things change around us in reality. So this became this really changed a lot of things for the ancient Greeks, and they had to, address this problem. So this had a pretty big impact on Plato, for instance. And Plato, what he ended up doing was constructing his theory of reality by kind of drawing a little bit from Heraclitus, and everything is change and you can't step in the same river twice, and then drawing from Parmenides as well, where nothing changes. And Plato basically broke it down into two realms of reality, so he could just basically say both are true. And for the Parmenides reality, where nothing changes, Plato called this the realm of forms, or the realm of being. And we can observe or gain truth from that realm through our minds and through reason. And so the realm of forms was like where everything kind of exists in this perfect state, and that was the truth that never changes. This is the realm where nothing comes into or goes out of existence. You might call it an underlying reality. And from the realm of forms, which is what he called it, we got the Heraclitus world, where everything does change and things come into being and pass away, and change and motion does exist. And that in this second world, we observe everything through our senses. And the world of forms can only be tapped into or accessed through the mind, through reason, and not through our senses. He thought that truth only existed in the realm of forms. This is Plato now. And that in the Heraclitus realm, the realm of becoming or change, only opinions and beliefs were possible, not truth. So basically, after Parmenides, a lot of philosophers were kind of like, okay, you have a point. We can't get something from nothing, but, we also don't like the idea that nothing changes and nothing moves. That didn't really jive with a lot of people, and that was probably his most controversial position, was nothing moves or changes. So they kind of tried to allow that something can't come from nothing but still explain change. And so this is where we get our last three philosophers that we're going to talk about. Democritus, Anaxagoras, and what is this guy's name? Empedocles. So I'm going to start with Empedocles, and I'm going to end with Democritus. And Democritus, as I mentioned earlier, is the laughing philosopher, and he might be my new favorite philosopher. He's pretty cool. So Empedocles looks at what Parmenides is saying. You can't get something out of nothing, and he's like, okay, yeah, I agree. And so his explanation was that he went back to all the four elements, the earth, air, fire, water, and he basically said these are the four roots of everything that exists, and they are eternal and just indestructible. They're basically all made out of these tiny, tiny elementary particles, little tiny fire particles, little tiny water particles, and that instead of changing or transforming, they just mingle. And when they mingle, that different combination of things is what produces all of the differences that we see that are really just an illusion, because they're all made out of the same four elements. And he thought that these combinations of particles had two forces acting on them. And these were the forces, or as I would love to say, the power of love and strife. And so he thought that love would bring particles together and strife repelled them apart. And so an organism, like a life, like a cat, for instance, was just a different combination of these four elements with these particles brought together by love, and that when death happened, they would separate out again. And these two forces, love and strife, are engaged in this eternal battle. And Empedocles was very religious too, so he sees like this whole divine aspect to this, the power of goodness versus evil. And he said there are 4 stages of reality through time, and the first stage was the ruling of love, the power of love. It's just the power of love. And love is wholly dominant. Everything's controlled by love. Strife doesn't have an effect on anything, and all particles, all these 4 particles, are unified and commingled together. There's no such thing as anything separate. This is the most divine state of the cosmos. This is also very non-dual. Nothing changes, nothing is different. But then we get to stage 2. And in stage 2, this evil force of strife starts to come in and separate things. And like, strife is the force that repels things. So like, it would be like pointing magnets at each other and then flipping them around, going from attraction to repulsion. And strife is the reason that existence happened, because strife pushed everything apart and caused motion and caused differences between things and caused separate things to exist. And so the cosmos in stage 2, strife is gaining power. Strife is like pushing things apart further and further. And when strife is winning, we're moving into stage 3. And stage 3 is when strife rules completely and there's no combinations of love. All of the roots are separated. All fire is separated from water, separated from earth and air. Nothing commingles to create things like life. Plant life, animal life, humans, whatever. And so this was obviously very bad place, very evil stage. And then love starts to come back in and bring things back together in stage 4. And so stage 4 looks just like stage 2, except that instead of strife getting stronger, it's love getting stronger. And eventually love will win and bring us back to stage 1 again, and it just becomes a circle. And this is this circular pattern of reality, which almost sounds like the theory of the universe with the Big Bang and then the Big Crunch, and that the universe just kind of expands. It's like everything is repelled away from other things, and then it contracts again.
Yeah, I was just thinking about that. Also kind of reminds me of molecules in a way, in a very scientific manner.
Yeah, it is, because he's talking about these tiny particles that make up everything, and just different combinations of these particles explain differences. It is actually very scientific, and that's part of why this is not religion, it's philosophy, because they're trying to explain with these hypotheses how all this works. Now, I say that, but Empedocles was very religious also, and he believed that, the force of love was good and the force of strife was evil, and he also believed that that's what causes people to do evil, is like the power of strife, and that we are in stage 2 right now because he saw strife in the world was winning. He saw all these horrible things that people do. There's all this suffering and death, and this is the worst time to ever exist. Everything's so bad. And so he said strife was winning, and soon it was going to dominate everything. Oh, I have this quote that I just thought was so funny. This is Empedocles describing the world, and he said, "The world is increasingly becoming a roofed-in cave, a joyless place where murder and anger and tribes of other spirits of death and parching diseases and wastings and the works of flux wander in darkness over the meadow of doom."
Jeez.
Right? I was like, oh my god, I thought it was bad now.
Do you would have think he like that we would have transcended stages now, like in the earthly context, or are we still in stage two? Do you think?
So he said stage 2 and 4 look the same, but that he thought we were in stage 2 because things were getting worse. I mean, if I were to guess, I would say things are getting better than they probably were around his time, especially because they had like slaves and shit.
Hmm.
Um, but he did think that you could transcend this world, and you could reach the ultimate divinity, which the Greek word is apotheosis, which is elevation to the level of divinity. Um, and I guess it would be like the all love power stage, and that he thought that humans were condemned to live in this either stage 2 or stage 4 or stage 2, 3, or 4. And that he actually believed in reincarnation. He thought we would be reincarnated through different lives, and we would be reincarnated over and over again until we managed to achieve apotheosis through being like super good and religious.
Oh, that's crazy.
Yeah, he was a little. He was very crazy. I say a little crazy. He was legendarily reported to have thrown himself in a volcano because he thought that he was so good and pious that he was basically an immortal god, and that when he died he would ascend to this divine realm.
It's pretty metal.
Yeah, I am a golden god, and then throw yourself in a volcano. Yeah, pretty wild. But he did have this, kind of scientific take on it with the particles. He also sort of described evolution. He was sort of the first person to describe evolution. He said that all of these living creatures around us exist because they just, by chance, became well adapted to their environment, and that any other creatures that came about that weren't well adapted to their environment died off. And so that's why we look around and we see only creatures that are well adapted to where they live, because there used to be creatures that weren't, and then they died.
That's pretty spot on, actually, for the most part.
Yeah. Yeah, it's pretty impressive, but just wait till we get to Democritus, because he is amazing. But yeah, so it was kind of the earliest description of adaptation, and trying to look at animals in their habitat and wondering, like, how did they come about to be suited to the climate and the just environment and all these things. So that's Empedocles. Interesting guy. Threw himself in a volcano. So the next two we're going to do Anaxagoras and Democritus. Anaxagoras was also responding to Parmenides, because that's what everybody was doing, because Parmenides fucking changed everything. And he was a philosopher. He was the first philosopher that separated mind and matter. So originally, the Greeks thought that matter had its own kind of animation, or its own kind of spirit, that it moved because it had an energy in it that caused it to move. But Anaxagoras basically said, no, matter is only moved by the mind, and mind is this separate force that acts on matter. And he was the first person in history to make that division. He was also born really rich, like Heraclitus. He shunned money, he got rid of it all, devoted himself to being a wandering philosopher. He was once asked, why is it better to be born than not be born? And he said, because if you're alive, you get to study the heavens and the universe. And how great is that? So he was looking at Parmenides and Empedocles, volcano dude, and he was saying, Empedocles doesn't really have it right. Because if everything exists of this combination of these particles, then how can something like a bone exist? Because there had to have been a time before the bone existed, because it grew into existence. And even if it's made up of these particles, you're still going from not bone to bone, or not flesh to flesh. So he was saying you kind of violated the Parmenides rule there, buddy, and we need a better explanation. So his explanation was that everything is in everything, which is like almost a stupid sentence. But what he means is that if you look at an apple, the contents of the apple contain the same contents that everything else does. So the things that make up a human, like flesh and bone and blood, when you eat an apple, it's not that the apple turns into your flesh, it's that whatever is made up, whatever makes up your flesh is already in the apple too. And these other philosophers said, well, then why do they look different? Why does the human body look different from the apple if they're made up of the same things? And he said, well, it's just a matter of concentration. Apples have more apple substance in them than blood or bone or anything else. Let's see. And so the main thing he's known for is the separation of mind and matter. He basically said that mind was the purest and greatest thing. It was this intellectual force that is the reason the universe exists. He said that before mind came along, the universe was just dead matter, and it wasn't changing, and it wasn't doing anything. And then mind, the power of mind, the power of intelligence and reason, came along and acted on matter, which caused motion and change. And that's what's happening now, is that matter is dead unless mind acts upon it. And it's motionless unless mind causes it to move.
Is mind solely contained within the context of people here?
No, he believed in a divine mind that came along at the beginning of creation existence and spurred all of this into being, for an end too, like for a purpose. But he said that after the initial push of this divine mind, everything became mechanical. So after mind got the whole ball rolling, you can explain everything else just through mechanical cause and effect, which was kind of an odd separation. He was almost trying to kind of mix creationism and like hard materialism by saying it started as creationism and then it became hard materialism.
So everything from that initial starting point of the mind just became mechanical?
Yeah, or able to be explained by these purely physical, materialistic means.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, so like he didn't use mind to explain the physics of like weight or dropping a ball from a height. Interactions between purely physical things didn't require mind to explain them, but he did use mind to explain like the beginning of creation. Yeah. And where are we? That was Anaxagoras. He was meh. But so what you are starting to see here is this process of looking at the world in this scientific way, and they're starting to get it narrowed down a bit. They're looking at the people that came before them and they're saying, okay, that's not quite right. It's got to be a little more maybe like this. And because they're working with all these previous ideas, it's like they're getting a little closer and closer as they go. And we come to Democritus, which is where I'm going to end today. He's so great. So he was called the laughing philosopher. He was called that because he emphasized the value of being cheerful and kind of being ready to see the comical side of things. There were some later writers that took this to mean that he was laughing at the foolishness of people, but I think it's a little more optimistic than that. He is also the founder of atomism, which drastically shaped the thoughts of Plato and Aristotle and the entire Western world, essentially. And the atomism is the idea that the universe is composed of these tiny particles called atoms, and the word atom comes from the Greek word atomos, and the A means non, and tomos means cuttable or splittable. So atom basically means the smallest particle that can't be cut any smaller. It's uncuttable. It's the tiniest possible thing that could make up everything else. And I came across a really great Richard Feynman quote here about this, and he said, if in some cataclysm all of scientific knowledge were to be destroyed and only one sentence passed on to the next generation of creatures, what statement would contain the most information in the fewest words? And Richard Feynman says, I believe that it is the atomic hypothesis, that all things are made of atoms, little particles that move around in perpetual motion. So, pretty powerful words. So he was born in northern Greece. He was basically a super genius. He was kind of like the Galileo of his time. He studied everything. He wrote about ethics, physics, astronomy, medicine, music, epistemology, math, agriculture, plants, painting, but hardly any of it survived. He was said to have written over 60 different works on all these things, but we only have a few fragments of that huge body of work and references by other philosophers that talk about what he said. And it's kind of a shame because it is probably pretty fascinating, and if there ever was a way to find out what he wrote, that would be incredible. He was probably one of the greatest early minds of ancient philosophy. So he came up with the idea of atoms, and his explanation for reality was that everything is just atoms and the void. And the void is this space in which atoms move around. And that these atoms were indivisible, which we of course now know that you can split the atom, but you might say that quarks are kind of like this concept now if we're to look at a parallel in reality and science today. But they're indivisible, according to Democritus. They're solid. They're indestructible. They exist in this void, which is empty space or nothingness, and that everything in the world happens when atoms collide and become entangled with each other, which is like right on the money. So atoms have no qualities at all, and I think you guys are going to really love this part. He basically said atoms don't have the quality of red or hot or wet. They are only defined by quantitative measures, things that you can measure and quantify, and they only differ from each other by their shape, their arrangement, and their position, which is like, it's like he's talking about quantum physics in a way. It's really crazy, and it gets even crazier. He said, philosophers asked him, how do we experience qualia? Qualia being like, how do we experience the color red, or the taste of sweetness, or, that this is hot and that is cold? How do we experience that if atoms don't carry those qualities? And he said, um, we distinguish, or we make a distinction between things that exist by nature or by convention. These two different ways. So something that exists by nature is something that exists even if humans weren't here to perceive it. So like if all humans were removed from the world would still be there. Matter and energy would still be there. These atoms, according to him, would still be there, but the concept of sweetness wouldn't. And the concept of red wouldn't exist. And those things only happen because we experience them when the atoms of the world interact with the atoms of our body. And that these experiences are subjective only, and there's no objective basis for something like the experience of red. This is a very famous quote by Democritus that I'm going to read. It says, "By convention sweet," and convention is this subjectivity, by convention bitter, by convention hot, by convention cold, by convention color, but in reality, atoms and void. So what you guys think about that?
Sounds like a pretty smart dude.
Yeah, definitely dive into a bunch of the sciences here. Really surprising. Kind of almost digs deep into the idea of like, oh, do we both experience like the same color in the same way, or is it like different due to our like own experiences or stuff like that,
Yeah. And yeah, that's exactly what he was saying. He was kind of saying, like, if you weren't there to perceive red, the quality of red, they call it qualia, wouldn't exist.
Wow.
Yeah. But he was saying that, there is still atoms there making up, the flower that looks red to you. But the atoms themselves don't contain the quality of red. Yeah, it's honestly pretty fascinating for someone who existed 2,000 years ago.
It's mind-boggling for that long ago.
Yeah.
Who were the other, if you could just give me a quick list, the other pre-Socratarian, I don't know if that's the right way to say it, philosophers?
PreSocratics. There's a few we went over.
Yeah.
We went over. Let me take up my list. We went over Thales, who was the first one, Anaximander and Anaximenes. They were all called the Milesians. And then we went over Heraclitus, who's one of my favorites. He's a good dude. And Parmenides. And Parmenides, I didn't realize how game-changing Parmenides was. That was really cool stuff. Then we did Empedocles, who threw himself in a volcano. That's probably going to be the main fact I remember about him. And then Anaxagoras, who was kind of boring. And now we're on Democritus, who is called the laughing philosopher.
Why was he called the laughing philosopher?
A couple of reasons. He emphasized the value of being cheerful in ethics. He thought it was important to kind of always see the comical side of life and to, be able to laugh at things and maintain a cheerful attitude.
Can I, always look on the bright side of life?
Exactly, yes. Yeah. Yes. Yeah, and he actually had a big effect on the Stoics as well. Let's see. He said, this is a little later. He said that we should master ourselves and our passions in order to achieve inner tranquility and inner peace. He didn't say that you had to, never experienced pleasure or passions. He wasn't an ascetic. He thought that you could have pleasures, you just had to do it in moderation. A quote from him is, "Self control increases delights and makes pleasures greater."
It's it's a little bit of wisdom that isn't isn't really practiced nowadays by most people,
Mm-hmm.
or by many people anyway, even though it's fairly obvious.
Yeah, it's kind of like the idea that if you ate ice cream every day, you wouldn't enjoy it as much as if you ate it once every 6 months or something, and then when that time came around, that once every 6 months you would like enjoy it a lot. um, yeah. Yeah, so he's mostly famous for the theory of atomism, that everything is made up of these atoms. Separating that from qualia is, I think, another really fascinating thing that he did, where all these other thinkers were kind of trying to say, yeah, everything's made up of little bits of fire and little bits of water, and he was saying they don't have any qualities of anything. It's just our experience and our interaction with these atoms out in the world and the atoms in our body that create this subjective experience of red or sweet. Um, yeah, and he was kind of everything in moderation guy. Another quote I found of his that is really good is, "The world is a stage, life an entrance. You came, you saw, you went away."
That's a good one.
Hmm. Very similar to that Shakespeare one, "All the world's a stage and all the men and women players."
That's a really like nice and almost kind of like idealized and romantic way of looking at it, almost. Because a lot
Hmm.
of people associate like dread with like the before and after, but it's like no, it's just like a place you get to perform for a little bit.
Hmm. And performance and plays were a huge part of the Greek culture too, so it makes sense that he used that analogy for it.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. Two other quotes that I found from him that are very interesting, and all of this makes me want to read more about him. I'm like really interested in Democritus now. I wish there was more out there. But two other quotes that I brought are, "In reality, we know nothing, for truth is in the depths." And what he was trying to say there is that you can't really understand the whole truth of reality because so much of it is hidden from our senses. We can't see the atoms because they're too small to be seen, which is, I can't believe he like came up with that idea. And he said, the void and the atoms are something that we'll never really be able to understand or interact with, and so in reality, we know nothing. He didn't say that knowledge was impossible, though. He did think that you can arrive at different truths about reality. It's possible to do that, but you have to use your mind or reason to do it. But you don't want to disregard your senses either. You have to use this combination of your sensory perceptions and the reason that your mind is capable of, uh, to go into the direction of truth. So this was a big difference from earlier philosophers as well, who were most of them were saying only the mind can get you to truth, and you have to kind of reject your sensory perceptions since they could be wrong. And many of them, especially Parmenides, were saying they are wrong.
So he It seems like he almost characterizes like a distinction between a universal truth that is like remains the core of everything versus the subjective truth that we all come to. Is that a good way of characterizing that?
Yeah, exactly. And
Okay.
that qualia, that sensation of sweetness or of seeing a flower as red, was part of that subjective aspect of it. And he did see that split between the objective atoms that have no qualia and make up everything, and then our subjective experience of reality, which does have the phenomenon of qualia. Yeah, pretty cool.
It's funny because it almost sounds like Eastern philosophy, with with the exception of like being okay with like the human subjective experience, or uh like not recognizing it as suffering, like Buddhism would, in a way. If the Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's part of why I really love that he was the laughing philosopher, because he saw this nature of reality. Another quote I have is that he said, "A person must know that he is separated from reality." And he also believed you couldn't ever really see or understand the truth about these atoms and the way they interact with us and what's really going on with all that. But he didn't become a nihilist like that, like Heraclitus did. Heraclitus also thought you can't ever really know the whole truth, but that made him the crying philosopher. And in contrast, Democritus looked at this, you will never really know. And in reality, you really know nothing about it, because the truth is so deep and so beyond what we're capable of knowing. And he just laughed about it. He was cheerful about it, and he didn't let it get him down.
It's almost like proto absurdism.
I was gonna say the same thing. I was gonna say the same thing.
It's all just absurd, and you can either laugh about it or cry about it. Yeah.
Yeah, and that's like my take on that is like, yeah, like when you look at it through this Western philosophical lens, like this, to me, like this is the where you end up at. It's like, it's absurd, or like there's nothing you can really do about it when you see, the truth in that way. And with Eastern philosophy, it's like, okay, this is our juncture right now. This is what we are. This is how we are right now. What are we gonna do to get past this?
Yeah.
Where, yeah.
Go ahead.
No, I didn't really have more to say.
Yeah, and this is one of the reasons I wanted to talk about the pre-Socratics so much, is because they really talk a lot about similar concepts that we find in Eastern thoughts like Buddhism and Taoism, the things like the nature of impermanence, the limits of knowledge, the role of the mind, especially before Socrates and Plato really changed everything. All of these pre-Socratics were delving much more into non-duality, like Parmenides, nothing ever changes, or impermanence with Heraclitus, everything is always changing, and Socrates, of course, really redirected Western civilization in a more concrete way. And I think Democritus really influenced him with the concept of atoms, but also, they were trying to get at this idea of truth and to understand the truth. And they went into a hard sciences way as compared to Eastern philosophy, which stayed in a more, how would you put it? More of a nebulous way, more of a contradiction, more spiritual, less. And not that they didn't have sciences, but their culture wasn't really focused around that like Western culture became. But yeah, that's part of why I like the Pre-Socratics so much. They really entertained a lot of these interesting ideas before they kind of locked down into Aristotelian ethics and Plato's forms.
Can I ask a question?
Of course.
Um, I'm not familiar with the entire like timeline of pre-Socratic era, but at what period of difference did Western philosophy start to develop from Eastern philosophy, or were they around like the same era in history?
It kind of was the same era, so and I think there's a reason for that. I think something happened in humanity that started to allow people to think about these things. But these guys were talking around the 600s, 500s BC before Christ, and
Mm-hmm.
um, Taoism was coming out around the 500s as well, I think. Now, the Buddha didn't come out until the 300s, so a little later. But Hinduism was, I think, around the 600s, and and then Taoism, I want to say, was around the 500s. So something was happening that was all in this short span of time, only a couple hundred years, where people were starting to question the nature of the mind and the nature of reality in a way that they'd never done before. There was this split between just thinking, oh, gods control lightning and gods control the rain, to trying to understand these processes, trying to understand the self.
It's very fascinating that although like there's obviously a lot more differences with Eastern and Western philosophy, but and how those cultures interacted and grew, but even despite all that, they managed to arrive at some of the same conclusions that early on.
Mm-hmm. And I think that the more you look at this stuff, the more you see a lot of similar messages and a lot of similar questions and conclusions.
I would say, I guess my yeah. So looking at it from in this conceptual way, like there is a lot of similarity, but I think of course, from my perspective as a Buddhist, um, the point where Western philosophy and Eastern philosophy here split is that they both kind of recognize this truth of subjectivity, I suppose, but where Eastern philosophy says here's how you overcome this subjectivity and what they would describe as suffering. Western philosophy kind of goes the other way, and in not recognizing how the Eastern philosophy would, not recognizing this subjectivity as suffering, and saying, in a way, saying from my perspective, like how can we suffer efficiently?
Hmm.
That's my hot take.
You know what? I do kind of see that, especially with how nihilism develops, almost like how the Enlightenment was in many ways.
Yeah, I think that Eastern thought focused a lot on the nature of suffering, but Western thought kind of, in answering suffering, they said that you have to live a virtuous life. You have to have a good life. And that doesn't just mean being, content or free from suffering, but they thought that, many of them thought that a virtuous life also would have to consist in, like, studying philosophy or studying the nature of the world, or finding a passion and devoting yourself to it. There were a lot of different aspects to what it meant to live a virtuous life that the Buddhism, especially, just completely, that's not even relevant.
Yeah, and that's like the point I'm getting to. It's really interesting because from most perspectives, to say like live a virtuous life and this and that, it would be a very idealistic in a way, I suppose. I'm not sure if that's the right word, but from the Buddhist perspective, even that is still human suffering, and so I think it's kind of funny when Democritus says that you can never know the truth, that it's impossible to know the truth. I think from the Buddhist perspective, it it's the complete opposite. It's like you can know the truth. That's the only thing worth striving for. This is what you should go towards.
I think the difference there lies in what they both interpret ultimate truth to be, right?
Yeah, I mean, does Buddhism say that you can know the truth about everything, or only that you can know the truth about, like, the nature of self?
I guess that's another conversation I'm not prepared or willing to go into. I think, but in both fields here, in both from both perspectives, we can say that there's a broader truth beyond what you can see with limited cognition or subjectivity or individuality or however you would like to say it.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's a very interesting juncture the way they split like that.
I don't think Buddhism says that you can know the truth about everything, but I do think that it is saying these are the truths about the most important things
I
from a
think
Buddhist perspective.
Yeah.
like
Yeah.
the
That's
truth
the
shall set
framework.
you free.
Yeah, that's what I was gonna say.
Yeah. It's not looking for how the universe works necessarily, but it is identifying what is most important about what we should know about the universe.
Yeah. It's kind of like it doesn't give you all the answers to all the questions. It's very specific in that there's a problem with, problem maybe isn't the best word.
Would you
Life,
say it kind of suggests you to not question, not necessarily about like yourself, but just like about the world and how it works, like to
I
be
think
content with that as it is?
I think it just doesn't really go into that. It doesn't bother to go into that
Oh,
concept.
okay,
It's not saying that you shouldn't or that you should. It doesn't touch it at all, really.
gotcha.
Mike, maybe you know this story, but there's I was just reading in a book I got of the Buddha. There was a tree and he with leaves that had fallen on the ground,
Mm.
and he took some of the leaves
Yeah, I know
off
which
the
one
ground.
it is.
Yeah, I think it's a good story for this. He took the
It,
leaves off the ground and he asked his monks, his followers, look at the leaves I have in my hand and look at the leaves on the tree. Um, do you think there are? Do you think the only the leaves in my hand are the leaves? And the monks said no, because there's leaves on the tree. And the Buddha said, the leaves constitute my knowledge. I know more than I tell you, but I don't tell you all of my knowledge because it doesn't matter for to release suffering, more or less. So that's kind of the Buddhist perspective on that. I think
Almost
it's
like a
interesting. I think it's interesting to talk about this philosophy and whatnot, but experientially, experientially for the goal, for the path, it doesn't really matter. And thank you, Lauren, for for putting up with the little sidetrack here.
No, I think, what's funny is that Socrates completely agreed with you. And that's why he changed everything about philosophy. Was all of these previous philosophers were trying to say, what is the nature of reality? What is the universe made up of? And Socrates said, all of that shit is irrelevant. And the only thing that we should be talking about is how to live a good, virtuous life. Because none of the rest matters to me. It doesn't affect my life.
yeah, knowing if you knew the answer of what's behind, what's motivating, what's moving all of reality forward or backwards or nowhere, whatever, it doesn't matter. Knowing that answer doesn't help you when you feel angry or upset. And so like this is all Buddhism, or what the Buddha was teaching was like, look, you exist. You have a life and you exist. And that there's this thing that's here in your existence, in your experience of this reality, of this experience, that doesn't feel great, and that's suffering. And so like that's where he just focused that. He just went, let's see if we can do something about that problem. And so that's exactly what Lauren was saying, or Socrates was saying, is like, how do you live a good life? How do you get to have a good experience within this reality?
it's almost it reminds me of the character like Dr. Manhattan, where he's like the master of everything with like limitless power and knowledge, but like he's not a master over himself. Like he's still ultimately depressed, and that leads him to self-destruction.
Yeah, it's kind of the opposite. You have very little control over very little things. We went into Stoicism, and it kind of dived into, like, control. What can you actually control? And so everything that you don't have control over is pointless and a waste of your time to worry about because you
Mhm.
don't have control over it. So let's only worry or only focus our attention on the things that we actually have an influence or control over.
How much should you have control over?
How much how much should you have control over what?
I guess just like in a general sense, like how do I
You should
kind of
have
have
as much as you have.
right? Because I feel like an excess of control or like the opportunity for control leaves you like at dissatisfaction.
I think most of that is just you think that you do have control over something, but you actually don't. And so that gives rise to like a frustration
Yeah, that makes sense.
or expectation. And then reality doesn't meet that expectation. And so then there's a feeling that is felt, experienced, that it feels negative. I think there was an example which was an archer pulls the bowstring back, and then the instant that he lets go, he doesn't have any control over it. All the factors of the universe are applying, meaning a wind gust could come by, anything could happen, and that arrow wouldn't hit its target. So the only thing you have control over is that pulling back of the string, and then maybe your attention, your focus, and that's about it.
I'm curious. How does Eastern philosophy develop more from this point onward? I don't know a whole lot about it. Since like the PreSocratics. Like I'm fairly familiar with how Western philosophy develops from where the PreSocratics, where we get like Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, and so forth, and they contribute their own ideas. I guess from this point onwards in history, how does Eastern philosophy begin to develop? Because it seems to have like a pretty like good understanding. I'm not sure how it evolves from here.
Well, Eastern philosophy is not a monolith, right? There's like Hinduism, Buddhism, Taoism, Confucianism, and then all the everybody who responds to them, like legalists respond to the Confucianists, and then Mencius arrives responding back, and so there's like phases. There's Neo-Confucianism, there's all that, and then there's Taoism, and then you got from the Tao Te Ching, then you got the Chuang-Tzu, and then more evolutions from there into like practical Taoism and things like that, and then Buddhism. You have like the birth of like hundreds of schools right across all the countries that it ends up infiltrating.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. There's a lot to unpackage there, and those are only like 4 or 5 major known Eastern schools, right? We're not even talking about Sufism, Islam, right? And all the smaller religions like Jainism and all that. So I don't know. That's a tough one.
Oh, it is. It's pretty
It's a big
broad.
one. That's a
I
broad
haven't
question.
uh, I haven't looked into the history, but would you say that like Hinduism was sort of like the first, and then it kind of like as it spread, it kind of developed, or other schools of philosophy or thought kind of arose out of that, and then changed as they got to different countries and kind of mixed with that culture?
Well, Hinduism doesn't um, leave India very much, right? Only a little bit, and then it kind of
Okay.
gets squashed by Buddhism
Yeah.
Yeah.
outside of India. And then inside of India, Hinduism kind of squashes Buddhism eventually. But yeah,
I just
but I don't know, but because a
haven't
lot of
looked
people
into
would
the
say
history.
like, a lot of people might not say that, or historians might not say that the Upanishadic period, pre-Buddhist, is even Hindu, in some
Oh,
ways,
that's true. That's true.
right? Or the
Yeah.
or but some Hindus would say that's early Hinduism. So I don't know. It's depends on your orientation to the history. I do think though that Western philosophy does a much better job of producing philosophers that contradict each other and dismantle each other, whereas I think Eastern philosophy is very referential and reverential and hierarchical. So I think it's not as exuberant or productive.
Yeah, that's kind of the impression I get. I don't know for sure because my only experience is really in Western philosophy, so I know more about that and can relate to, oh, hey, these guys disagreed on like this many things, and we're able to produce like this synthesis of ideas afterward.
Well, and Western philosophy also moves along with, in a lot of ways, with colonialism, right?
Oh,
I mean,
absolutely, yeah.
so, and industrialization, and so I don't think you get Marx without industrialization, right? And so
Oh, yeah, that would be
you know,
impossible.
so I do think that there's something to that, but I don't know. But when you look at Buddhism specifically, I mean, it goes through so much permutation wise, you know,
Mm-hmm.
it evolves so much um, that it's hard to say. You'd be hard pressed to say that it's not creative, right? So.
Oh, yeah.
um, For some, like Mahayana Buddhism is indistinguishable from Theravada. Or sorry, is utterly distinguishable or something? Or what do I mean to say? It's
Completely
like,
different.
yeah, completely different. God damn it. How would you sum up the pre-Socratics though, Lauren?
How would I
Like,
sum
how
them
would you
up?
sum them up as like, are there some contiguous or like thematic things about them that distinguish them from later post-Socratics?
Yeah, so, well, Socrates is the reason they're called pre Socratics, is because everything changed with him. And so they're mostly distinguished by talking a lot about metaphysics. What is the nature of the universe? What is it made up of? Where did it come from? What is all this stuff that makes up the substance around us? What is change? Was another big one. And Socrates just kind of came along and said, none of this is relevant. Let's talk about what it means to live a good life.
Do you think that's like the line in the sand where he's like they're all trying to figure out like the substance or the answer, and he's like basically like saying, oh, this, like you just said, none of this actually matters, let's focus on what actually matters. And so like that's the line.
Yeah, I'd say that's part of it. I mean, Socrates did sometimes talk about metaphysics like that, and the pre Socratics did also talk about virtue. Like Democritus thought a good life was living with moderation, kind of the middle path, and he greatly influenced the Stoics, as did I think Heraclitus as well. And of course, Socrates and Plato, I mean, they're kind of almost maybe the same person. They kind of drew from all the pre Socratics, they studied them and looked through what they were saying and tried to build concepts or ways to get at the truth. Like, how do we figure out what is true? And with Plato's forms, they kind of settled on that as an answer and built from there. So they all kind of agreed on this process of truth and getting to the truth, and from there developed the scientific method.
Yeah, it's kind of fascinating from, I guess, from Socrates. What happened after that, as contrast to pre-Socrates, is it, the different branches of philosophy and science and like politics start to section off into their own thing. With pre-Socrates, we saw a lot of um, kind of emergence with all those things. Like, oh, science was within philosophy, and it's after that it's starting to be explored as its own concept afterwards.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and a lot of these philosophers were also scientists. Like
Yeah.
Democritus studied astronomy and botany and medicine. Um, I'm pretty sure a lot of the others did as well. And they were studying the natural world in a very physical, scientific way. And but yeah, the main difference I would say is that Socrates kind of said the real answer for philosophy is how to live the good life. And I think that's part of why he's so famous for saying, I know nothing. Because he wasn't trying to say that, there's this objective truth out there that we can get to, or that it even matters what the universe is made of, which is kind of what Democritus and Heraclitus were saying, is that we can't get at these ultimate truths, in the end. And even if we did, how would we know that we were right? It's not like we can fact check with God or something. So he kind of brought it back to logical processes of the mind. How do we reason? What are logical fallacies? A lot of debate stuff. What does it mean to live a good and virtuous life? Was like the really big thing. And that transformation into ethics is a huge part of what defined all of the later philosophy after him. And I would say Western philosophy in general since then has hugely been about ethics rather than the nature of reality, because that eventually turned into science as well. But you might say that's different from Buddhism because with Buddhism it's more about the nature of suffering and being free from suffering, whereas with Western philosophy it's more like what what does it mean to be good? What is the difference between good and bad? And how do we live a good life?
Mm-hmm. How do you form morals and values and whatnot?
Mm-hmm. Which I think goes into the nature of suffering. Like, it's obviously all related, but it's funny how different it is too. Sometimes I'm surprised at the overlap, and sometimes I'm surprised at the lack of it.
Yeah, I think Buddhism gets more into a like a fundamental what they would say a fundamental suffering. A lot of these Western philosophers, Socrates would cover more of a base level of suffering or a uh, artificial. I'm trying to think of the right word. Uh, a lesser level of suffering, I guess. I can't think of a good word for it. Superficial, superficial. That's the word I was thinking of.
I'm wondering. You're kind of, they didn't really address suffering so much. It was kind of like they just accepted it as a part of things, and we're trying to think. How do you live a good life with it, rather than how do you escape suffering? It's like they were just approaching the question in an entirely different way.
I think it's certainly valid. Um, I think I've met a lot of people who, if you ask them or if you told them like this is how you escape suffering, they'd say, "Well, I'd rather suffer." And I think that's a perfectly valid thing to say. Suffer in that fundamental human sense.
Do you think there might be like a good marriage between Buddhist thought and like critical examinations on ethics and morality?
I'm sure there are. I mean, there are basically. Not that I'm really qualified to talk about them.
Mm.
Well, Buddhism has the Eightfold Path, which does it is almost like an ethical guide. You have to follow right action, right speech, right practice, all these other things, and there's ways you can do that wrong. And there's like a whole subsection about how you interact with others and doing that in the right way, which does, it is kind of a shame that they didn't go into it more. I've heard that there are a lot of writings that expand on each step of the Eightfold Path, but from what I understand, or from the main people that I've read, they don't really go into what does it mean to have right action, and how do tell the difference between right and wrong action.
Yeah, that's something that's always kind of fascinated me, and I don't know if I ever find like good reading resources on that. I definitely look into it. Because I've always wondered, it's like, how do Buddhists go about solving like the trolley problem or something like that? Like, do their philosophies kind of navigate you through those kinds of decisions, or do you just kind of have to come to your own conclusions?
Yeah, Mike, you might know more. Do you think does Buddhism have an answer for something like the trolley problem? Do they really address what is right action?
So yeah, the Eightfold Path, you were right about the difference, and this breaks down into like three major categories, which is wisdom, ethics, and practice or meditation. And so the ethics part, well, all of it is should be kind of held with the middle way in mind. So neither extreme, like neither this is ultimately good or this is ultimately bad. So I think you were kind of on the right track of like, it's sort of like your own, in a lot of ways, it's your own, like, what do you feel would be correct with the decision of the trolley. There wouldn't be a Buddhist correct answer there.
I see what you mean. So it's more so just giving you the mental facilities to arrive at your own conclusion rather than to give you one.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's left open, and it's left open for for reasons.
That's funny. That's actually Nietzsche's conclusion as well on the subject of ethics, because he, you know, uh, basically took ethics and said there is no moral objectivity, and you have to create your own set of morals and values based on your own self. What's the word I want to say here? I don't want to say self-discovery, but kind of like he said, you have to look inward to discover these truths for yourself, and you can't rely on a religion or a god or anyone else telling you what is good and bad.
Mm-hmm. Oh wait, but one of the main Buddhist things is to like abstain from taking life. So how does that integrate into the trolley problem? Are you kind of compelled to not take any action?
Well, yeah, I guess that's a very good question. It's a very good question, very hard question because like, yeah, you shouldn't you should abstain from taking life, but again, these things should be done in a middle way, like kept in
Right.
mind, right? Like if somebody's attacking me, we use this example like to not take life. If somebody is attacking me with a knife, they're coming at me with a knife and I can tell like their purpose is to kill me, and maybe I deflect their hand and they still just keep coming. Well, I have a life too. And so now there must be a decision made that I must defend myself, my own life. I don't want somebody else to take my life either. Um, so what would I do? I would try to defend myself to the point where I would hope that the person would stop attacking me, um, and I wouldn't have to end a life. But if that never happens, and it seems that the in that moment the only way to prevent that from happening is to maybe hit him, or give him some blow that maybe ends his life. Would my intention be to kill him? No, my intention is for him to stop doing what he's doing. But if that's the result, then that's the result.
Well, it reminds me of the blind monk who stepped on all of the bugs because they didn't know where they're going. It's not due to intent.
Right.
It's the intent to inflict harm. I guess
Exactly.
that's where the bad comes from, rather.
Yes. So you're just abstaining, or your intention really is probably a better word for it. Your intention is not to take life. But if you stepped on a bug, but it was completely by accident, then there was no wrongdoing there. And I know this is a silly example. I think that's plenty of an example, but I remember being at a monastery and I was help building some stuff, and I stepped on a board and I heard a crunch, and I was like, oh no, and I flipped the board over and I crushed a lizard, and I was like, no, I didn't even know he was under there. Like, I love animals, and like I felt really bad, and like I went over to the edge of the dig site, the construction site, and I like dug a little hole with my hands and put him in there and buried him, and I was like, I'm sorry, little guy. But see, there you go. There wasn't intention. I didn't know he was
Right.
under there. It just happened. There wasn't anything. I didn't do anything wrong.
Now,
Yeah, no, I agree.
that does seem a little different, though, from like killing someone else to save your life, because that's not an accident. That's a decision. Like, I'm going to take a life to save a life.
Right. I guess that wasn't. I wasn't really using my words very well. I would say maybe to restructure that there was a struggle there that ensued, and he maybe happened to, like, I get the knife away from him, but he like kind of lunged at me, and like then he kind of thrust himself on that knife. The intention wouldn't be, I have the knife, so I'm gonna stab him.
I feel like in any instance of like self-defense, especially with like a lethal weapon of some kind, like the act of engaging is itself kind of like an acknowledgement of, oh, this could go down and like someone dying, whether it be like me or the other dude.
Right. I guess, and if it was me and I was putting myself like in like a real situation, I would feel okay if he was trying to attack me with inflicting some pain to his body in a way that it would deter him from continuing what he was doing. I wouldn't want to kill him, but I would
Right.
definitely feel justified with inflicting some amount of pain to the point where he wanted to stop. And then I would stop inflicting pain immediately. I'd be like, okay, we're done. Good. That's all I wanted. Now we're good, and I can get out of that situation.
Yeah, no, that's pretty sound.
Yeah, so then we come to the question of the trolley, though. Would a Buddhist pull the switch and kill one person to spare the 6 lives that were going to be killed?
So the question is, right, there is no way out. One or the other must happen, right?
Well, no, you don't have to do. Yeah, either 6 people die or 1 person dies, but you don't have to do anything.
Okay, so if you would I have the knowledge of which track it was on, and I know full well the situation?
Yeah.
Okay, so let's say, I guess that is a kind of a question, because like, would I just not touch the lever at all, no matter which track it was on? Was it on the one that's going to kill 6 people, or was it on the one that's going to kill the one? Would I just not touch it at all?
Well, it's because I guess with the original trial problem, the train is going towards the 6 people, but you can then divert the path to the 1 person to minimize harm.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I guess I don't know. I guess I think that really depends on the person. Where
Well, yeah, because
one
there's different
or
versions
more.
of the trolley problem. because I think like there's one version where the 6 people are just random people you don't know, just random pedestrians, but then the one person is like a close friend or family member. Do you still pull the lever?
Mm.
Yeah, or the 6 people are like all clones of Hitler.
Yeah, we can go down that rabbit hole of like flip flopping which of the things, or maybe it's 6 people that you know and one person you don't know.
There's 6 people on the track and one person on the other track, and they're all you.
Yeah.
But you're also the one pulling the lever too.
Yeah,
But then it really doesn't matter.
it goes down a heck of a rabbit hole because if you say, just to keep it simple, okay, I don't know any of them. I see
Mhm.
it's going to kill 6 people, and I decide, okay, I'm going to pull the switch and save the 6 and just kill the one person, and that way 5 lives are saved overall, and, it's basic utilitarianism. The next question, which is like probably my favorite twist on this question, is okay, let's say you were a doctor and you had 6 patients who were about to
Oh, no.
die, and you have one healthy person in the waiting room who would save all 6 patients, and they would go on to live, healthy, full, good lives. Um, how different is it from pulling a switch to kill one to save 5?
Yeah, that's the thing. Like, it's worded in an entirely different way, but I guess on a very moral level, it isn't that different, except that you're doing like a lot more activity to ensure the 6 other people like are saved.
Yeah, it feels different even though it's fundamentally not, because I could easily just say, would you pull a switch in a hospital to kill one person to save 5? And if
Just a
not,
signature,
you're not even the
right?
doctor, yeah.
Yeah, you just make a signature and that happens.
And so if the answer is no, then what is the difference between standing at the train track and being in the hospital?
Hmm.
I think I would pull the lever to kill the one person and save the many.
But would you also perform the operation?
Yes.
You would?
Okay.
You would kill a
Yep.
person in the waiting room to save
To
6?
save.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's the same situation. It's
Because
exactly the same situation.
Yeah.
in a world like that, that means that if you are a healthy person and killing you could save a bunch of other people who are dying in the hospital right now, we're justified to come into your house and kill you, even if you don't want that.
Well, that's not really saying that.
Kind of.
It's more so like an
Okay.
isolated instance, but if you were to like characterize an entire culture and nation behind those beliefs, yeah, that would be
Okay, are you saying that there's a healthy person like in the waiting room and you just kidnap him and strap him to a table and you're just ripping out his organs and, to just like use him as
Yep.
some kind of like,
Yep.
okay, well, you didn't go that far. I was imagining there's a person on the table, he's there for an operation, and like, maybe things aren't going so well for him. He could survive, but like you'd be like, okay, let's not take the risk of this guy maybe dying. Let's just kind of use his organs.
No, because it's just like the train tracks. That one dude, he's not at risk of dying. He's going to be perfectly fine unless you pull
Yeah,
that
he is. He's
switch.
standing on a fucking train track. He is at risk of dying.
No,
So I
it's
guess
going the other way.
so I guess Lauren, would it be better to not pull the lever and to like have that just kind of be the way of things, to deter people from having like a cultural understanding of, oh, we can come into your home and harvest your organs to save like 6 other people at any given time?
No, I mean, I would
Well,
pull the lever, I how could
go
you
ahead.
not? How could you
Yeah.
not?
If
But
you were asking me though, if you were asking me, would you be okay, like, if somebody came up to me and said, "Hey, we have 6 people in the hospital, and you're like an exact match, and like, you would would I die to save those 6 people?" I think I probably would. I'd be like, okay, like, how long do I have? Do I have at least a week?
um,
I
you
have a
know,
couple hours to, say my goodbyes.
Yeah.
That's my thing.
Wow.
If like I had doctors come up to me and say, "Hey, man, I need you to die so we can save like these 6 other people," like I'm not sure I would make that decision. I think I would be very like selfish in that regard and be like, "No, man."
Dude, I think I would too, unfortunately. Like, I don't think I could do it. If somebody asked me to sacrifice my life to save 6 people.
I
Because I
mean,
mean,
it's
I
not
guess you
gonna
could.
hurt. I'm just gonna go to sleep, and that's gonna be it.
Because I guess one question would be like, why is it just me? Like, oh, why can't me and like 2 or 3 other people like split up that burden to where like everyone makes it out alive equally?
'Cause that's not the
Um,
Well,
question.
yeah, we
yeah,
can
I
we
mean
can
that's
come up with
true.
details to explain why, it's got to be you or nothing. Like they're going to die now. You're the person here now or whatever.
Just split second decision.
I think it's more
Yeah,
fun. What if it was only 3 people you were going to save? Or what if it was only 2?
I don't know.
Mike, would you still give up your life for 2 people?
Maybe not.
It's harder, right?
Yeah, I mean, there is so many details in that, like,
What if they were
my,
children?
yeah, right. If they were children, then probably. If they were like older people, then maybe not, because, like, you know, time, experience, like, yeah, they've had some time in reality, like,
Well, I guess like when it comes to, I guess like should we be ascribing moralistic characteristics to the individuals in question? Like, should that even be a relevant factor?
I
Because like
mean,
ideally all life should be treated equally, right? Like it shouldn't matter if like the person on your track is like your bestest friend or just some like random person off the street, right?
it
Well, see, I
shouldn't
don't think it
matter.
goes into should or shouldn'ts, right? This isn't
Hmm.
like objective. It's you. It's just a question just for you. It doesn't matter how anybody else answers it. It's just how do you feel
Oh, for
about
sure.
it? And so, like, it shouldn't matter. It's not like everybody should think this way or this is the right way to think. It's just, no, how do you feel?
Well,
Hmm.
for the individual, I think that's good. But when we try to extrapolate ethics into a society and we try to do things like make laws, we do have to kind of say like, no, this is what you're supposed to do, or this is what's illegal or legal to do, and we start to have a moral line drawing between what's okay and what's not okay. Like if you're trained in paramedics, for instance, you legally have an obligation to help someone if you see them in cardiac arrest or something. So that's not that different from whether or not you have a responsibility to pull that switch. Have you done something morally wrong if you don't pull the switch?
I don't think I would say that you would be in the wrong to not have action.
What if it was 6 children and
Not
one Hitler? Right?
no
And you
action.
don't pull the switch? What?
No action is still a decision, right?
Yeah. So are you guilty of something though?
Yeah,
Well,
I
because
mean,
then I think you can
you're
also
not making a
extrapolate.
choice.
You can also extrapolate that to like lesser things, like oh, you didn't donate this much to charity, even though you could have. Why didn't you? Or it's the simple problem of the boy falls into the well and you rescue him, but you have to do that every day, and eventually there becomes a tipping point where you're just like, oh, fuck this kid, I don't care anymore. So it's like, where's that line you draw
Yeah.
for like charitability and how that could or could not be legally mandated of you or morally mandated of you.
Yeah, it's tricky.
I say do what you want. Just do whatever you want, man. You don't want to donate, that's
Uh,
fine.
If you do, you do, and you don't, you don't, and
That's
that's all there
true.
is to it.
Beautiful. To be or not to be.
I think the questions are great, but the reasons behind your answers are even better.
Oh yeah,
Hmm.
absolutely.
Yeah. And I guess you can really only do the best that you can in each scenario. So, like, Yeah, you might pull the switch and save 6 people, but if you ended up as, a doctor in that same situation, you might think, well, it's different because I have this duty as a doctor to not harm anybody, or um, death is just a part of life, maybe, and these people are dying from, things that happen to everyone. But then why pull the switch? I don't know. God, it's so strange.
These questions also, something to keep in mind is the person, you as a person have had so many experiences so far up to your life. You may answer differently later on in life.
Oh
So
yeah,
these
definitely.
questions are like where this person is now, because you're answering from your position in your experience right now.
Mm-hmm.
You ask these questions to little kids, they're gonna have radically different answers.
If you guys are interested in this, I don't know if you know the channel Vsauce on YouTube, but
Oh
he
yeah.
he recreated this experiment modern day. He basically got these people into a like visit for a day train switching station, and then the guy gets called out of the room on a phone call and they're alone, and he just showed them briefly how to switch the track, just as hey, check this out. And then they can see all the cameras, and they see a train coming, and they see these 6 workers on the train, on the track, and they can switch it away where there's one dude. And he basically recreates it for a bunch of people, and sees what their decisions are, and asks them afterwards why they made that decision. And some people don't do anything because they're afraid to touch it, or they don't know if they should. It's so interesting.
I think split second decisions, would be might have a different outcome from something like maybe you're given a day to contemplate your decision.
Oh yeah.
Like Lauren's example of this guy, they're in that moment and they didn't know what was going to happen. They have to make a decision right then. But you may have come up with a different decision if you were given time to really sit down and think about it.
All right, well, we sidetracked a little bit, but I think this was a pretty good Sunday session.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah. Right. Well, did you guys have a favorite pre-Socratic?
I forget their names because they all sound very similar.
I know, right?
Volcano guy, very cool, very funny. I definitely read more into him, and the the laughing philosopher, that was really fascinating too.
Democritus, he was the best with the atom theory. So cool.
Yeah, with atom theory, oh my gosh, I was not expecting that.
Yeah, I had forgotten how close he got to being, scientifically right.
Oh yeah, well, based on the resources he had at the time, it's yeah, there's no way he would have figured out that it was possible to split the atom, but everything else, right on the nail.
And I love the idea of the void that the atoms move around in. That's an interesting concept too, which we didn't go into probably enough.
My favorite was the same as yours. It started with an H.
Heraclitus?
Yeah.
Interesting. I would have thought you would like Parmenides because he's more, everything's the same and nothing changes. And Heraclitus was almost the opposite. He was saying, everything changes, nothing's ever the same.
No. I like that one better.
Nice. Yeah, I love Heraclitus. We quote him all the time in the bot. It's almost like a koan. You can't step in the same river twice. It's like...
It is.
It's a very resonating statement.
Cool. Well, this was super fun. Thanks for being here, everybody.
Of course.
Yeah, thanks for leading.
Yeah, I'm so glad I finally got to talk about them. They're so interesting. And now I just love Democritus even more. Yeah. I should get like a little art thing that's like the laughing philosopher and the crying philosopher, and like that split. It's just so poetic.
Oh
You
yeah,
know,
that look
I
great.
meant to say something, but I didn't want to interrupt your little flow. And that's like, it's very common for people who wake up to the truth that usually the response is one or the other. Either they laugh or they cry.
Please interrupt my flow at any time. I feel like I go on too much and I like lecture too much. Callie gets on me about this all the time.
All right, have a good one.
Alright. Thanks for being here.
That sounds good.
Alright, bye.